Welcome to these wonderful panelists. Let's go around and just introduce yourselves real quick so everyone here knows who you are.
I'm Pat, and I'm from DAOstack.
From DAOstack.
Yes.
Oh, by the way, those mics are a little quieter, so speak up.
Hello, I'm Yalda, and I'm co-founder of Autark, and we're part of the Aragon network DAO.
Nice.
I'm Lane. I'm a core developer. Worked on Ethereum for a while. Working on Space Mesh and some other projects now, and just huge fanboy of like DAOs and all things governance.
My name is James Preswhich. I'm the co-founder of Suma. We work on cross-chain interoperability, and I got invited to this panel to be the governance minimalist.
Also, you might know
Seeing
him
as I'm
from,
the governance maximalist, you put us next to each other
Twitter.
for a reason, right? We might like fight over here.
So in Will's talk, he was talking a little bit about DAOs. I assume a lot of you know what DAOs are, but I think because we want to use this panel to try to kind of explain some of the terms, some of the ideas, I want to start with DAOs, and I would love it if one of you guys, I don't know who wants to go first, would like to define a DAO for our audience.
DAO is a blockchain-based organization. It can be something like Bitcoin, where it doesn't really have any rules, where you install a software, you operate, or it can be something like an organization where you are collaborating to accomplish a specific mission, and it requires human coordination. So there's a very autonomous, like decentralized autonomous DAO, and then there's the other one that has to do more with like human autonomy. So that's a more worker-based DAO.
Why? So DAOs, the word DAOs, we're sort of seeing that emerge again, but there was an older DAO. What was the older DAO? What was the DAO?
Lao Tzu. The DAO.
The original DAO.
The DAO.
The DAO that can be named is not the
The
eternal
DAO
DAO.
that can't be named. Do you want to take it?
I'll take this one.
Go.
Back in the olden days of Ethereum, like 3 years ago, there was this thing called the DAO, and the DAO was a group funds pooling mechanism with voting and curators built in. The idea was that we would make an autonomous venture capital firm for the Ethereum ecosystem. It raised about $250 million at 2016 Ether prices and had control of a double-digit percentage of all Ether, essentially. So the DAO crashed and burned about 3 years ago. It was hacked. Tens of millions of dollars of Ether were drained, and it resulted in a hard fork of Ethereum.
On at all? Hello? Oh, there. Was when that DAO crashed and burned, did the whole concept of DAOs kind of like did it affect also that idea of organizing in a decentralized way, or was it just this particular model that was affected?
I think it definitely affected the name DAO.
We jokingly say DAO has been a dirty word for the past 3 years, and it's true, but I think we're like over it as a community, as you can see from all the amazing DAO projects that are happening now. Finally, it's about time.
Is there anything? So.
Oh, and I want to say one more thing. A lot of people, so some of the like amazing governance-focused people like the Aragon guys, shout out to you guys in the back, like Luis has been quoted as saying 2019 is the year of the DAO. I just spoke to him a moment ago. He changed his mind. It's the decade of the DAO now.
Oh. All right. So I do wonder, we have some pro-DAO people here. Is there anything that you can say against DAOs? I don't know if you guys could do that. Okay.
You want to go first?
Oh, no.
They are likely not legal. How's that for a starting point?
Oh.
Where is Vlad in the house? Do we want to?
I don't know.
Well, I was going to say something very similar. Is the laws are typically that in the absence of another legal structure, you fall back to a general partnership. So a DAO is not like this independent organization. It's a general partnership of all the members. So what makes a DAO different from just us starting a club? Like we can just start the Maker Club, and it's the same thing as a DAO.
So I'm actually going to amend what I said. It's even worse. It's not that they're necessarily illegal. It's that they're likely illegal, and you probably don't realize that they're illegal. But you could be held liable as a general partner.
All right. Well, this is something to put in our pockets for later when we can discuss this all together. Let's keep going with some definitions. On-chain, off-chain. What is on-chain? What is off-chain governance? Silence.
So when I think of off-chain governance, I think of what's called soft governance. I think of norms. I think of social consensus. At the end of the day, a DAO is made of people, and people have to come together to agree on proposals, and they have to agree on what gets funded. They have to agree on the next version of an exchange's smart contracts if they want to upgrade an exchange. And that requires a lot of talking, and it requires norms. It requires cooperation, a community, and it requires means of facilitating discourse that's ultimately positive and moves that community forward.
But what's the exact definition of off-chain governance for those who maybe aren't familiar with this at all?
So off-chain governance is exactly what we do all the time in every government ever. The new concept of on-chain governance is kind of automating the mechanics of governance, right? Automating the voting process, setting down rules in the form of smart contracts over who gets to vote and what votes can be on, right?
And so off-chain is the off-chain is regular governance.
Off-chain is the default that we've been doing for social processes with people.
I think it's helpful to highlight a distinction raised by Nick Szabo. He talks about the distinction between what he calls wet code and dry code. So wet code is code in the legal sense of the word, code that's interpreted by the human brain, whereas dry code is code that's interpreted by machines or computers. So I might draw a distinction and say that on-chain governance is written in dry code, off-chain governance is written in wet code.
Right. And I think we've defined now on-chain governance. On-chain governance is decision-making kind of automated, where a decision, a vote, will actually immediately trigger something on-chain.
At least a portion of it is written in dry code or a smart contract, yeah.
So what's wrong? No, what's great? Let's start in the positive. What's great about on-chain governance?
Not a lot.
It's efficient.
Okay,
That's
wrong
what the
answer.
argument is. It's efficient.
Okay, it's efficient. James, I want to hear something positive from you.
We'll get there, don't worry.
Okay.
You can make decisions and agreements without relying on a traditional court.
I would say systems tend to be very clearly articulated, which can be helpful if you want to make decisions.
So like Lane said, and others have said, we're trying to automate this and make it more efficient so that the things that we can all collectively unanimously agree should happen do happen, and they happen immediately, and they happen on-chain, and it's publicly verifiable. And that's the kind of promise and vision of on-chain governance.
So
I want to throw one more thing out there. I believe this is something that Gavin Wood talked about, and as many of you here may be familiar, he's a huge proponent of on-chain governance. A lot of Polkadot is built around some of his ideas, the ideas of himself and Al and many of the other amazing thinkers on the Polkadot Web3 parity space. So Gavin said that in the ideal case, on-chain governance is an oracle, which is to say that the actual governance has already happened off-chain, and we kind of all know what the result's going to be, and it's just an oracle whereby the decision that was arrived at socially off-chain gets voted and locked in on-chain. That's one way to think about it in a positive way. A form of finality around
Okay.
off. Yeah, okay.
So now I'm going to open the gates. What's wrong with on-chain governance?
Plutocracy. Sorry.
It can be gamed.
It can be gamed.
Yeah, it's a mechanical process. It can be gamed. We have to set out all the rules in advance, and we have to stick to those rules because they're on chain. In social processes, we can all fall back to we don't feel like doing this anymore. This was a bad idea. Let's cut it. But when you have on-chain governance, you don't have as many good options for doing that.
What's a nightmare scenario with on-chain governance?
Can I add one more bad thing first?
Okay.
Because there's a few more we missed.
I can talk about bad things all day.
I'm not done listing.
Oops.
We really lose the human interaction. I think, when we have this on-chain governance. Most of the interfaces that we have today are not good. They're very bad. People can't access them. People can't use them. We're making all of these decisions that are so inaccessible to 90% of the people, 99% of the people out there. And then we're trying to give this idea that on-chain governance is good. Emergent networks that are governing themselves, they do it in a face-to-face way. They talk to each other. They communicate with each other. And we just don't do that very well, and we haven't designed the right interfaces to facilitate that.
And one of the ways that one of the things we haven't solved for is identity, right? And this goes back to what James said. It's gameable. It's Sybil attackable. They're like putting people in a room and discussing things is a super old-fashioned technology, but it's Sybil resistant. It kind of works, right? So maybe we don't want to throw that away completely. I had one more, and I lost my train of thought.
Well, I want to continue. So the last point on this is, what is a nightmare scenario of both off-chain and on-chain? What are the nightmare scenarios?
Well, the nightmare scenario for on-chain governance for me was, what if a whale acquires a lot of tokens and votes no on Autark's proposal, and because of some tweet I said that pissed some rich person off?
Yeah, that's terrifying.
That was my nightmare scenario.
I mean, for me, the nightmare scenario is Skynet. It's pretty terrifying, right? If we have AI and we have on-chain governance, and you combine the two, which I think will inevitably happen, then there's rule by the machines, which is terrifying. I'm not ready for that yet. And this brings me back, I just remembered what I wanted to add, which is that it's hypocritical, at least at this stage, to do on-chain governance, because ultimately there are still human beings, people like core developers and community members who need to be able to intervene for upgrades or bug fixes or something like that. So ultimately, the on-chain governance still has to serve the social layer, I hope. And if we lose that, that's the nightmare scenario.
Well, I think the thing here is that governance is supposed to reflect the will of the governed in the long run, right? And what we're talking about here with the original The DAO, with a whale buying up all the tokens, with some sort of AI botnet on the blockchain, is things that we would all agree are miscarriages of justice, that the governance process has gone wrong and we can't fix it. And so with the DAO, we all had to get together and break Ethereum permanently. That code is still there and still runs on every Ethereum full node to undo all those changes. So it's something that the nightmare scenario is that governance goes on and the mechanical process is disconnected from the human process.
Decoupling, maybe.
Yeah, just like there's regulatory capture, I imagine there can be technocratic capture by ourselves, in a sense.
Yeah. Isn't everybody who actually implements the governance system really the ones ruling? If you write the smart contract, doesn't it say what you wanted it to say?
And did we make it accessible?
But that's what we wanted it to say at the time. Maybe what we want it to say now is different because governance should be dynamic. Another more realistic nightmare scenario for me is that it's just declared illegal everywhere and then either goes away or becomes some even more black market than it is now, right?
I mean, okay, but I mean, governance still, some form of this. Oh,
it's up to you.
Okay, we're gonna have one pro on-chain. Do you want to say something? Okay. Well, I'm actually about to switch topics. But we can talk after. All right. So governance, right now we're talking about a worst case scenario, a nightmare scenario, but we still have to kind of get back to the reason for why we need this in the first place. And one of the reasons, kind of one of the major reasons, is this idea of distribution of funds or funding. Recently, and this is actually kind of to your point, where if you're using on-chain governance to fund particular initiatives, it will be the will of the people, and if that is gamed, then the funding will change. One of the topics that's come up kind of in the governance context, and one that I like to talk about, I know one that you like to talk about, is founder rewards or block rewards. Because this was a fun governance battle. So why don't we help define that for everyone? What happened? What is a block reward or a founder's reward? Let's start with that.
Okay, so block rewards are usually discussed, so by way of context, by way of background, they're usually discussed in the context of proof-of-work mining. The idea being that every time a miner on a proof-of-work blockchain like Bitcoin or Ethereum produces a new block, they get they get a small reward and a certain number of tokens, like 2 Ether today in the case of Ethereum, deposited in their account or wherever they want it to go. In the context of governance and funding the public good, sort of, when we talk about block rewards, we're saying that some fraction of a reward or of that reward, you can think about it in absolute or relative terms, goes into some sort of DAO or some sort of multi-sig or some sort of, you could think of it as a foundation receiving those funds to then be spent or invested in the public good, things like infrastructure, things like core development, hypothetically marketing, anything that sort of benefits everyone in the chain. And this is one way to solve the sort of tragedy of the commons or collective action problem around funding things that benefits everyone that no one wants to be the first one to pay for. That's the definition of tragedy of the commons, kind of. Do you want me to say more?
What's wrong with that?
It's a tragedy.
No, but what's wrong with the idea of taking a small piece of the kind of rewards that would normally go to miners or validators and giving that out to the developers maintaining the system?
Well, what do the developers do with it, and who decides? When we take block rewards, what we're doing is we're transferring money, wealth, from all of the holders of the coin to the miners and the developers. So this is our money as users of this ecosystem, and it's going to this private party, and what are they doing with it, and how are they accountable to us? And so this is the problem that governance is intended to solve, right?
So I'm glad you mentioned that is the reason we're talking about this on a governance panel. That is the link, is that this is at its core, as so many other things are, it's a governance problem. And I agree, I think in principle this is a great idea. In practice, I think the reason we haven't seen this in more blockchains like Ethereum is because we haven't solved that governance question around it. And as we've seen, we may intend it to be a relatively small amount of money, and that could suddenly become a relatively large amount of money, and it's very hard to govern very large amounts of money.
Can you guys maybe share another example of a case where, and maybe something more recent, I haven't actually been following all the battles on Twitter, but maybe another example where you can see kind of the issue is the governance?
I mean, that's the case in so many things. I feel like 85% of the problems we're dealing with reduce to governance, maybe more. Let me think of specific examples here.
Yeah. Do you have an idea?
Wealth distribution.
There's sort of a universal governance today that's driven by a single motive, and that motive is the profit motive. We look at corporations, what are they trying to do? They're trying to maximize the return to shareholders. And that's actually a very bad value for the commons, for the majority of people. It ends up, you have a centralization of capital, you have an accumulation of capital, you have multiple crises that perpetuate throughout various economies, the global economy, and we really need to figure out a way to decentralize that and have better governance processes around that so that we can benefit everyone more equally. So governance is sort of ubiquitously bad today. It's not 85%, it's 99.99%. And we're here to offer new models to create new subjectivity, new subjective spaces, so we can really start to solve this, so we can really start to brainstorm and experiment and iterate. Yeah, my sound changed.
Cool. All right, so I want to bring this back to sort of the game context and gaming governance. What does gaming governance look like?
So I have this game I like to call, which is I call it Captureopoly.
Okay.
And it just to highlight how any sort of anytime you take governance and you formalize it into a set of rules, I can game that. And maybe given that this is the governance games, we could actually play this game on stage if you want to. It's kind of fun. But
maybe at the end.
Yeah. It's just one example, right? Okay, we give each person one vote. Okay, then I spin up a bunch of Sybil identities to attack the system. You say, okay, cool, no problem. We're going to do reputation. It's going to be based on. We're going to use source cred. Much love to source cred, by the way. Amazing project. Let's not use source cred because source cred actually will solve this. We're going to naively say that it's based on the developers. How many lines of code do you contribute? I'm like, okay, I take my source files and I split them into one character per line. We can go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for hours.
No?
What was the question again?
What is gaming governance?
What does gaming governance look like?
Well, we've kind of already touched on this. Like, we brought this up earlier. When a whale buys all of the governance tokens, that's gaming governance. They've taken this public process and they've perverted it for private benefit. Any mechanical process we can come up with, to Lane's point, can be gamed because it's mechanical and we're smarter than it.
Hello? I wouldn't say a whale buying a lot of the tokens is gaming it. If they were buying it and they wanted to, like, do something that's not for the greater good of the network, that would be, I guess, trying to game the system in general, like where they don't care if their decision is going to result in a financial loss for themselves. They're just, like, doing it to troll. But if they were a whale that acquired them because they thought they could make a valid decision because it would increase the value of their tokens, then that's not necessarily gaming the system.
I think you could make the argument that, like, if they were playing by the rules of the system, then they're not gaming the system. Like, you could make the argument, and people have made the argument, that the DAO attacker, there was no gaming going on. They were just playing by the rules of the system, and their actions were perfectly legal. I think a lot of these things we can only judge these things at the social layer, which is the entire problem with trying to encode things. It's like, kind of, you know it when you see it, but you can't give a strict definition for it.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a different angle here and move away from blockchain.
Yeah, that's what I was actually going to hope, because
Gaming governance is when the Walt Disney Company goes to Congress and changes the IP laws for the entire United States because they paid off the right lawmakers for their campaigns. Gaming governance is when we don't have a transparent system like a blockchain where we can see these financial arrangements and we can call them out and we can be represented, but because we understand what's going on, we can see the big picture.
So, the reason I brought up the whale is it's the same as the Disney case, is once there is a whale with a majority interest in governance, the governance system no longer serves us, it serves that person's interests, right? And so this is why I call it gaming, is because now the governance system exists to take our money and use it to profit someone else, not us. So when we say gaming governance, I would prefer to think of it as corrupting the process in a meaningful way. Whether you're Disney, whether you're a whale buying tokens, whether you're the developers who wrote the governance code.
So what you're saying here, though, is, like, if there's a system that's very clearly articulated, then it can be gamed. What if there's no system?
Also gameable.
Can no system be gamed?
Also gameable.
Even more gameable. That's the problem.
So how is it being gamed today?
No system is either more or less gameable, depending on whether your system biases towards change or towards stasis. Stasis is not gameable. If you look at, like, Bitcoin, the governance system takes 3 to 5 years and consensus of hundreds of people, and then probably you'll still get nothing done. Very hard to game.
Okay.
Slow governance unless you're benefited by the status quo, in which case you want nothing to change, like you like small blocks.
Add more voices.
Everybody wants.
The question was that if there's no system, it's kind of a naive question. If there's no system, can you still game governance?
Can you still game it? Yes, you can take advantage of there being no system to form an inner cartel of sorts and implement the tyranny of structuralistness. Not implement it, but live it out.
Live it out.
Yeah.
So good governance is like a very recent phenomenon in the history of humanity, okay? Human beings fought for thousands of years to throw off tyranny and to move away from a world where we have sovereigns, we have kings and queens and empresses who have arbitrary rule, who can just do whatever they want to do, who can control wealth and power and hold people's lives in their hands. It took God knows how many lives, how many wars. It took the Magna Carta, it took the French Revolution, all the revolutions that followed. And what people were fighting against in all of that was lack of explicit governance, right? It was the arbitrary power in the hands of a very small number of people, a single person or a group of people. So this is my complaint with the situation we have now, right? If we don't have an explicit set of rules, then there is still an entrenched elite that will form and that will stay in power. This is called the tyranny of structurelessness. It's very real, and we're very captured by it today, at least in Ethereum.
What does it look like? Is it Twitter? What is it?
So
Where's the tyranny?
how many people in this room have worked on an EIP or an ETH hard fork? Me, a couple others
Hands
around
up
here.
if you have.
Very well.
Yeah. So 3 or 4.
Next question, Tom.
So how many of you guys use Ethereum? That's a good next question, Lane. Yeah, right. So all of you guys use Ethereum, and there's about 4 people in this room that make the decision for you. And that's what tyranny of structurelessness looks like. It's us, it's me, it's Lane, it's that guy over there, it's this guy in the front row. We're the guys who just stepped up and decided it was our job, and now we're in charge. I'm not deeply involved in this process, just enough to get a few interesting things through, but whoever shows up is in charge, and that's how tyranny of the structurelessness works.
And more to the point, we talk about Ethereum governance. We'll just keep picking on Ethereum because why not? As being super open and transparent, and anyone can participate. And while that's strictly speaking true, the reality is we don't have mechanisms in place. If anyone, I'm sure there are many people in this room who would be interested in contributing, and I encourage you to do so. But we haven't documented the process. It's unclear how you get involved, how you join an all-core devs call. If you do author an EIP, it's unclear how that gets brought up on the call. Well, I'll tell you what actually happens. What actually happens is we know each other and we have Telegram chats open and we chat at events like this. That's also the tyranny of the structurelessness, right? We need mechanisms to make this stuff explicit so anyone can participate, or at least know the rules.
Cool. All right, so I think we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that anyone in the audience would like us to speak about? If there's anything we haven't defined, let me know. I'll give you guys a moment. Oh.
It seems like there is a lot of clarity in this whole blockchain technology implementation that, named Ethereum at the moment. The whole purpose is that at some point you have to sell it out to the traditional businesses and then move from the traditional way of doing things to this promise to be more secure way of dealing with a lot of things. So I want to know how they're buying into it now.
The enterprise world?
Yes. Do they? Or
Answer that.
how do you sell it to
Do one
them?
other question and we're done. Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll do you have some ideas on that?
Yeah, I don't think we should, to be honest. I think we should discover, again, a space where we can be creative and we can design new forms of organization. I think the firm has worked well, the corporation has worked well for a very long time. I don't think it's working anymore. So our challenge right now is to figure out how do we move past that collectively.
Wait, we're going to do a lot more interactive stuff soon.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll just keep going.
On kind of the flip side here, the way we're currently selling governance to traditional businesses is to venture capitalists. If you look at a lot of the governance tokens that are out there, their significant shares are owned by traditional financial firms like Andreessen Horowitz, like Polychain. So right now, we're just selling them the promise of money and control over these ecosystems. In the future, we hope that things like DAOs will sell traditional enterprises on new mechanisms of management, new mechanisms of shareholder engagement, and some alternative to a board of directors. But we don't know exactly what those are yet.
We had one other, and then I'm going to wrap. We're almost there.
So
For this panel, then we have another one.
I did
Okay.
note earlier that there was a lack of any on-chain governance support on this panel, which I'm
I
fine
didn't
with.
either.
Well, and that often leads to a not ignorance, but ignoring of the crypto-economic incentives we can build into governance to fight against things like plutocracy and vote buying, and distribute power in a way that the body politic is not disenfranchised and able to participate in a way that is positive. And I think that the on-chain governance is plutocracy really is holding us back from really fully understanding and exploring the possibility, because it isn't all bad.
Cool. Well, thank you
That's
for
not
that.
a question, but that's a goddamn comment.
That's a good perspective for all of us. I think that rounds us out really nicely. I hope you guys got a bit anyone who's new to the space or isn't used to this terminology, I hope we helped a little bit. For those who know it, thanks for being patient. So we're going to take a break. There's going to be some snacks. You might still have those red tokens. You can exchange them for beer. We were going to do a game, but we didn't get it together in time. We're coming back in, I think, like 20 minutes. And then what we're going to be doing is this park bench panel. And yeah, I guess I'll explain it then. But with the park bench panel, if you are somebody who really has strong opinions, try to stay in like the front rows or on the edges, because you might be coming up on stage.
It's going to be awesome. Don't miss it.
Hey, don't oversell. All right,
Awesome.
mingle, drink, enjoy, and we'll see you soon.